I found myself watching the latest Short Fat Otaku video on what is a grifter. And within that video, there is a very interesting philosophical debate between YouTuber Vaush and one of his guests. And the debate is about the nature of truth. What is truth? Vaush believes that truth is something that comes from power. A powerful institution gets to dictate upon people what the truth is, and that is the truth. The other guest believes that truth is objective in nature. Truth exists whether or not people believe in it. And this got me thinking, why do people want to know the truth? And does everyone actually want to know the truth? And the answer to this, I think, there are people who legitimately don't want to know the truth. There are people who value unity and harmony over knowing the truth. Because in this particular meme, you have a number that is drawn. And it could either be a 6 or a 9. And in the vision of people who don't care about the truth, both of these people could be correct just so they can avoid conflict. Just so that one of the people doesn't have to lose face by being wrong. So it's good to just let things the way they are. It's good not to question, because by questioning, you create this harmony. But then there are people like myself who actually value knowing the truth, even if it comes at the expense of conflict. Because at the end of the day, a person actually drew there a 9 or a 6. And there are ways that you can pursue in order to find out. You can see if it aligns with other buildings, if you can see if there's other numbers there, you can see if you can find the guy who painted it and ask him. There's a multitude of ways of trying to find out the truth. And at the end, if you literally cannot find whether it is a 6 or a 9, it is okay just to say, we cannot know for sure. You don't have to have an opinion about something that you legitimately do not know. So why are there people like me? Because there's a lot of people that have this obsession with wanting to get to the bottom of things. Like what is truth and what isn't. And why do people do this? Because sometimes fiction is a lot better than truth. Sometimes believing in something that's false can be comforting or can give you certain power. And the reason that I think people want to know the actual truth is so that they can make predictions, so that they can make decisions in the present based on what they know, and those decisions, according to them, will have good results. For example, the best TV show of all time, in my opinion, has to be the recent show about Chernobyl, the Ukrainian nuclear power plant which exploded. And in that show, the version of truth was the one that Vaush likes, the truth that comes from positions of power, the truth that comes from the state. The state decided what is true, and by doing so, hid valuable information away from the scientists. And the scientists working under the version of truth by the government ended up causing a catastrophic nuclear meltdown, which affected the lives of millions of people. Destroyed the environment and had policy which made nuclear energy to be unpalatable for a lot of politicians at that time, and even today. So the reality is that despite the government decided what is true and what isn't, what ended up happening was that the explosion was very real. The government couldn't use language in order to make the meltdown not happen. Now, the government could try to hide the meltdown. It could get people to pretend that the meltdown isn't there and to just go on their day-to-day lives. And people could literally, under oppression, just pretend that everything is fine. But reality would be that it's not fine. Because here's the thing. There are several philosophies that we need to take into account. So this, for example, is very real. Like, it exists. It's an object that has certain properties that is rooted in reality. And whether or not something is written inside this cup, you don't know. But just because you don't know doesn't mean that reality is going to be affected by your knowledge. If something is written in this cup, then it's going to be there regardless of what you say. If something isn't written in this cup, the same thing happens. So what is truth? Well, truth exists. It's in nature. It is empirical. It exists. When people start talking, when people start describing what they have experienced, that's when lies can happen. So lying can only exist within language. Everything else is true. If you have a car crash, that happened, it's true. The way people describe the car crash at a lawsuit, that can now have manipulations and people's opinion of it and different versions of it. But it doesn't change the fact that it happened. It exists in real life. Now, you might have some philosophers which say, yeah, but how do you know that reality is real? How do you know you're not a brain in a jar? How do you know you're not in the matrix? And to answer to these philosophers is that, well, you can't really, right? If you're a brain in a jar, then no empirical evidence can prove or disprove this affirmation, which is why we realize that we can't function in a prosperous society using that assertion. So what we do instead is we try to use logic. And in logic is like, if you can't prove something, then it doesn't mean it's false, but what it means is like we're not going to take it into account. Unless you can prove something to be true, using the scientific method usually, then you might be right, you might be wrong, but we're just not going to change our lives based on what you're saying. So if someone says there's a pink elephant on the moon, there might be. I can't disprove it, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that it is logical to live my life based on that assumption. So we need to root ourselves, we need to ground ourselves in reality using logic. Now, there are other philosophers that accept this, and they say, yes, okay, there needs to be an anchor into reality. But they will say a human being can never accurately describe truth. So if we take the same Japanese teacup, right? I can say that the teacup in its upper part is red. And this is a truthful observation. It is red. But then you can have a postmodernist that comes up to me and says, no, it's got white spots. Therefore, you are wrong. Therefore, everything you said about the teacup cannot be trusted because you're a person that's disingenuous and manipulative. And, there is a version of truth to that. I mean, yeah, it's not entirely red, but when we use language, it's usually given the benefit of the doubt that as long as a person at least tries to be honest, if they can see that I'm not trying to mislead people by saying that the upper part is red, and the very fact that the object seems to have red as an overwhelming property and the white dots are the exception and not the rule, you can use this type of truth as genuinely acceptable. Like, if you're speaking with another person, they don't have everything they say to be like mathematical definitions and everything needs to be 100% true. Like, if someone tells you that a chair is a piece of furniture with the designation for sitting, then you can be charitable and not go, oh, but what about a stool? Oh, see, you're being disingenuous. No, like, the definitions we use are not mathematical and they allow room for errors. But as long as the definition overwhelmingly fits what the person is describing, then it's passable. And I suppose, like, if you want to say that truth needs to be 100% pure, otherwise it's a lie, well, then I guess everything outside the realms of mathematics and what we can experience by seeing without speaking should be true, right? Now, there is the scientific definition, which is the one that we use the most in order to try to find out the world. So maybe a scientist comes up and says that the upper part of the coffee cup is red, and it becomes scientific knowledge. I mean, if you can do the scientific theory and it comes to the conclusion that, yeah, like the overwhelming part is red, okay, fine. But then another scientist comes along and they say, no, the over part is blue. So he does the experiment, turns out that it's not blue. And then his version, his scientific theory falls. and we do not take it into consideration. But then some other scientist comes and it's like, yeah, it's red, but it's also got white spots, and he proves that it's got white spots. Then his scientific theory becomes the new accepted one, because it completes something that we already knew. Now, the idea of Vaush, of truth coming from power, is completely different. And it doesn't take into consideration anything that I've said up till now. The idea of truth comes from power works like this. Let's say your boss gives you this teacup and they say it's blue. And you are looking at it and you're saying, no, it's not. It's red. It's white. It's got white spots. It's definitely not blue. Okay, you're fired. And then the boss goes to the next employee and goes like, this is blue. And the employee goes like, no, it's red. You're fired. And it goes to the third employee. It's like, it's blue. Eventually, if the boss does this, people are going to say it's blue. Now, it doesn't mean that the people believe it's blue. It doesn't mean that the people have been persuaded by the corporation. No, what it means is that the boss is threatening them. Lie about the coffee cup, say that it's blue, or else you get fired. So people aren't convinced, they don't think that it's blue, but what they do know is that if they don't agree with the boss, they're going to get fired. Now, Vaush considers this to be power creating truth. And that is, I suppose, a cynical way of viewing things, that the people that have power over you can actually make you do things. For example, in North Korea, when the previous leader died, everyone was on the streets crying. Now, it's unlikely that every single person that was on the streets crying was genuinely crying because they were heartbroken about Kim Jong's father passing away. What is more likely is that they were threatened by the government that if they don't cry, they're going to have to face repercussions. And that's what's happening, right? And you have like various groups that do enforce a certain collective thinking, where if you don't think exactly what you need to think and you don't say the things that you need to say, then you're being ostracized. And this thing where like truth comes from power does benefit the powerful corporations and institutions. So for example, in North Korea, the idea that everyone needs to cry when the previous dictator has passed away or there's repercussions benefits the regime. Because now the regime is very aware that a couple of dissidents have outed themselves by not crying. It sends the message that even thinking against the regime is unacceptable and bad things can happen to you. And they maintain power by pushing this version of truth. And it existed in my country as well. Like there were a lot of legends about the dear leader who was incredibly smart and economically savvy. And, you know, he could speak 20 languages. And like, a lot of these things weren't true. But they managed to do this because truth comes from power. At least this ideology was being the one that was the norm. And then you also have the Lysenkoism, where a socialist scientist who rejected evolution because he thought that's a Nazi concept and socialists need to distance themselves as much as possible from the Nazis. But the objective thing that evolution is real was real regardless of not if the Nazis believed in it. Like the theory of evolution is scientific fact. But he thought, okay, well, if they believe it, then he applied the fallacy of genetics, which means that if a bad person believes in something, or if a bad person says something, then by definition that something is false, which is obviously easy to debunk. Just because Hitler says 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't mean mathematics is evil. So he said, no, genetics is evil because the Nazis were pushing it. And he said, we need to push a version of socialism on plants. So if you have like various plants growing in a similar environment, they will help each other out in order to prosper. So because of that, he decided not to use fertilizer anymore and tried his theory. Ended up causing a massive famine in the USSR. And of course, the government didn't want to view themselves as being responsible by backing this awful person. So they blamed the farmers because they didn't Lysenkoism correctly. And everyone that disagreed with Lysenko or tried to provide an opposite theory would have immediately get fired or persecuted or sent to a gulag. And yeah, that's what Vaush is saying, that truth comes from power. Like, I mean, yes, the powerful can get people to behave in certain ways under duress. So under threats, and it doesn't even have to be threats necessarily. Like, Imagine if I were to say this coffee is blue, and the boss goes around, and anyone that says, yeah, it's blue, gets a promotion. You can do it that way as well. It doesn't have to be the stick. It can be the carrot. Overall, I do think truth exists. I think it's important for us to pursue truth, because only by knowing the truth can we make accurate decisions today, which are going to have potentially good consequences in the future. And I think this is why most people want to know the truth. It's not necessarily a snobbish thing. It's more to do with, can you have the correct knowledge in order to make the correct decisions today? So for instance, if I want to make a bank loan, and I think that the economy of the nation is great, and I'm going to be able to keep my job, and even if not, I mean, there's very low unemployment, so I can just find another job, then I'll make a decision based on what I know. But what if what I know is false, and the economy is actually doing very poorly, and we're heading to a recession, so when I make the bank loan, I actually do a bad decision? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You know, like the powers that be, the politicians can say, oh, the economy is flourishing. It's the best it has ever been. It doesn't change reality. The reality is that the economy exists, and it can either flourish, stagnate, or go down. And if the economy is going down, and I don't think that is the case, and I make a decision that's impactful, whether or not things are going to be the way they are, well, then it will be a poor decision. So this is why I think people are striving to know the truth. Let me know what you think, though. I'll see you guys in the comment section. Take care.